In a packed Senate chamber, Ted Cruz cornered Jasmine Crockett with relentless accusations. She didn't flinch. Moments later, she dropped a 4 a.m. call, 2 sworn statements, and 47 seconds of damning audio. The room froze. How fast can power collapse when the truth hits like this? And when it does, who's left standing in the wreckage? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Senate hearing room was a cavern of tension, lit by cold, clinical lights that gave every face a pale, unflinching clarity. The rows of chairs were lined in perfect symmetry, the kind of order that made every sound seem sharper, every silence heavier. At the center, Ted Cruz leaned into his microphone, his voice like a blade, cutting straight through the room. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "did you or did you not attend a secret meeting in the early hours to broker an under-the-table deal on the defense budget?" His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory, dripping with the confidence of someone who believed the verdict was already written. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on Cruz, absorbing every word without so much as a twitch. To the casual observer, it might have looked like she was caught off guard, but her stillness carried its own weight, a quiet defiance that unsettled the air. The clock's second hand ticked loud enough to be felt, not heard, as Cruz leaned forward again. "If you deny it," he said, his voice sharpening, "then swear it right here, right now." A murmur rolled through the chamber, a ripple of anticipation. Jasmine didn't answer. Not yet. The silence stretched just long enough to make the room's collective breath feel like it was hanging by a thread. The silence that had stretched across the chamber after Cruz's last challenge was still hanging heavy, a silence thick enough to make the air feel heavier, tighter. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the kind of pause that makes people lean forward in their seats, straining to see who will break first. Cruz, sensing the tension like a predator catching the scent of blood, moved in without hesitation. His voice came fast and sharp, each syllable deliberate, calculated to leave no room for escape. "Yes or no, Congresswoman? Did you meet in secret? Yes or no? Were you there to negotiate that deal? Yes or no?" He didn't speak these questions like a man seeking the truth. He spoke them like a man building a trap, snapping it shut one bar at a time. His words were relentless, coming in a rapid-fire rhythm, each demand punctuated with the kind of cold certainty that dares the other person to flinch. Every time Jasmine shifted, ready to answer, he cut her off with the same 2 words, "Yes or no," like a hammer slamming down on a nail before it could slip out of place. It wasn't dialogue anymore. It was a siege. The effect was suffocating, a tightening coil that everyone in the room could feel pressing inward. The senators seated around the horseshoe table glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of anticipation and discomfort. Even the aides lining the wall shifted uneasily, caught in the rhythm of Cruz's verbal assault. The air seemed to grow warmer under the bright, unforgiving overhead lights, but no one moved. All eyes were locked on the space between Cruz and Crockett, as if the entire room had been reduced to that narrow gap of table and microphone stands. Then Cruz, with a small, almost smug pause, reached beneath his folder and drew out a single sheet of paper. It was printed on plain white stock, the edges crisp, the text highlighted in places that he wanted the room to notice. He held it up between his fingers like a piece of undeniable truth. His voice dropped into something slower, more deliberate, as though savoring the blow before it landed. "According to this," he said, letting the pause sharpen the suspense, "you were at the Hilton Hotel at exactly 4 a.m. The words seemed to echo longer than they should have. A ripple of sound moved through the room, not loud but unmistakable. Chairs shifted. Pens tapped quietly against notepads. Somewhere in the back, a soft exhale cut through the air, the kind of sound people make when they're bracing for what's next. Jasmine didn't move, didn't even blink. Her hands stayed folded neatly on the table, her shoulders square, her gaze still locked on him as if nothing in his tone or his so-called evidence had managed to penetrate. But Cruz wasn't finished, not even close. He set the paper down in front of him with careful precision, like a chess player making a move he thought could end the game. From a manila folder resting on his stack of documents, he produced a photograph, black and white, grainy and slightly blurred, exactly the kind of image meant to suggest something without ever proving it outright. He held it high enough for the senators, the aides, and even the stenographer to see. His voice rose with the weight of performance, his words meant for the record as much as for the room. "And this," he declared, pausing just long enough to make the anticipation bite, "is you leaving that hotel after an illegal meeting?" The statement hit the room like a sharp crack of thunder. A murmur swelled and then broke apart into scattered gasps, the sound spreading in waves from the front of the chamber to the farthest seats along the wall. Faces turned toward Jasmine, some curious, others already convinced, as if waiting for her to stammer, to backpedal, to deny. Instead, she simply shifted her gaze toward the photo. She didn't lean forward. She didn't reach for it. Her eyes passed over the grainy outline of the figure Cruz claimed was her, and in that brief flicker of recognition or dismissal, her expression barely changed. Only the faintest curve appeared at the corner of her mouth, a smirk so subtle it was almost a private gesture, not meant for anyone else. She said nothing. No denial, no explanation, no counterattack, just silence. And somehow in that silence, the balance in the room shifted. It was the kind of quiet that didn't signal retreat but control, the kind that left everyone else wondering what she knew that Cruz didn't. It was the pause before the storm, but it was also a reminder. Sometimes the most devastating answer is no answer at all. The smirk was still faint on her lips when Jasmine leaned toward the microphone, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the room lean in. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like the opportunity to speak without interruption." It wasn't loud, yet the authority in it was undeniable, the kind of tone that made people stop mid-breath. Cruz's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into slits, but he didn't speak. Slowly, with deliberate precision, Jasmine reached down to the floor beside her chair and unlatched a matte black case. The click of the metal clasps echoed faintly, a sound far too small for how much tension it carried. From inside, she drew out a small USB drive, no bigger than her thumb, but in her hand it looked like the trigger to something far larger. She held it up between two fingers, turning slightly toward the chairman. "This," she said evenly, her eyes never leaving his, "is audio evidence directly related to the matter Senator Cruz just raised." The reaction was instantaneous. Cruz lunged forward, his chair scraping the floor, voice booming across the chamber. "That evidence is inadmissible. It's not part of the hearing record." His words were a swing meant to stop her cold, the kind of move that relied on bluster as much as on protocol. But the chairman didn't flinch. He kept his gaze on Jasmine, the pause stretching long enough to make the entire room hold its breath. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen stopped scratching. The air conditioning hummed faintly, the only sound besides a faint rustle of papers as the senators waited. The chairman's eyes moved from the USB to Jasmine's face, then to Cruz and back again. For a moment, it looked as if the weight of procedure might win. Then with a single nod, he said, "Proceed. Dictum." It was just one word, but it landed like the crack of a gavel, final and absolute. Jasmine rose from her chair, the scrape of its legs against the floor somehow sounding louder in the pin-drop silence. She walked the short distance to the clerk's desk, each step deliberate, and set the USB down in the port with a soft click. The screen above the chamber flickered to life, the system humming as it processed the new file. A low, almost imperceptible tone pulsed through the speakers, the audio system signaling it was armed and ready. Every eye in the room was locked forward. Now no one shifted, no one whispered. The air felt heavy, charged with the anticipation of whatever was about to break the stillness. The hum of the playback system dissolved into a sharp crackle, and every head in the chamber tilted forward as the speakers came to life. Then it came clear, unshakable, and dripping with certainty. Ted Cruz's voice called at 4:01 a.m., speaking to defense lobbyist Robert Ellison. "Make sure the defense budget passes. If it takes cash to win, so be it." The words didn't just land, they detonated. There was no hesitation in his tone, no room for misinterpretation, just the flat, transactional coldness of someone giving an order he had no fear would ever be heard. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Some faces froze in disbelief. Others turned sharply toward each other as if silently asking, "Did you hear that?" The air itself seemed to thicken, each second stretching as the weight of those words sank in. Somewhere near the back, a chair creaked under a shifting body. In the front row, a pen slipped from someone's grip and clattered to the floor, loud in the tense quiet. Cruz's shoulders jerked as if struck, his face flushing a shade darker. In a sudden burst, he lunged toward his microphone, gripping it like a weapon. "This is fabricated," he roared, his voice bouncing hard off the marble walls. The denial rang out, but the hiss of the recording still lingered beneath it, a ghostly reminder that the words had already been heard and could not be unheard. The shockwave of Cruz's shouted denial was still pulsing through the chamber when Jasmine leaned in, her voice cutting through the tension with a calm precision that made every head turn. "The recording," she said, her tone steady but edged with authority, "was lawfully obtained from an FBI surveillance device installed under the order of Judge Eleanor Whitmore in connection to an entirely separate investigation." Each word landed with deliberate weight, her phrasing measured like a prosecutor reading a verdict. The implication was unmistakable. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't theater. This was legally sanctioned evidence. Cruz let out a short, brittle laugh, the kind that tried to pass as amusement, but cracked under its own strain. It didn't mask the truth. If anything, it amplified it. Under the harsh, unforgiving lights, beads of sweat began to form along his hairline, catching and glinting like tiny betrayals. He shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders as if to shrug off the heat, but his movements only made the unease more visible. The chamber was so quiet that the faint whir of the ceiling fans seemed loud. It wasn't the kind of silence that left room to breathe. It was tight, constricting, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. Every set of eyes was fixed on him now, some sharp with accusation, others wide with disbelief, but all unblinking. Even those who had sat back moments ago were leaning forward, elbows on the table, watching him like they were waiting for a crack to widen. Cruz's fingers tapped once against the desk, then stilled, the tiny sound swallowed instantly by the room's oppressive stillness. It was no longer just about the voice in the recording. It was about the man sitting there, visibly feeling the weight of it, the heat of proof pressing down, and knowing there was no easy way to step out from under it. The echo of Jasmine's calm, surgical explanation still clung to the walls when Cruz suddenly erupted from his chair, the force of his movement sending it scraping sharply across the marble floor. He stabbed a rigid finger across the table, his arm trembling with the kind of anger that's equal parts fury and fear. "This is a political scheme," he barked, his voice ricocheting off the high ceilings. "You are smearing your colleagues." The words came fast, his tone almost theatrical, but there was a frayed edge beneath it, a quiver that betrayed more than he likely intended. His stance was wide, shoulders squared, a man trying to project dominance while fighting the sense that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. She sat in the same unshaken posture, her hands folded neatly on the table, her gaze steady on him like she was watching the last few drops of sand slip through an hourglass. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise to meet his. It dropped, low and precise, each syllable sharpened like the click of a lock. "Senator, I have more than just this one clip." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The sentence landed with a weight that stole the air from the room. The space between them tightened, the rest of the chamber leaning into the silence that followed. Without breaking eye contact, Jasmine reached down to the sleek black case at her side. The clasp clicked open again, 1, 2, and she drew out 2 more USB drives, placing them deliberately in the center of the table where every senator, every aide, and every camera could see them. She didn't waste time with theatrics. The labels printed on each drive spoke for themselves. The first read, June 14th, 2:37 a.m. Cruz with Ellison, Weston, Georgetown. The second, August 3rd, 11:58 p.m. Cruz with Ellison, Capitol Office B214. Both files captured the same voice, deep and deliberate, Ted Cruz speaking with Robert Ellison about funneling political contributions through neutral PACs in exchange for favorable defense budget amendments. In the June clip, Cruz could be heard saying, "We can reroute it through the Veterans Fund. No one's going to flag it." In the August recording, his voice was colder, more clipped. "If they want the vote, they know the number. Same arrangement as before." It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern methodical, repeated, and impossible to explain away. For a moment, the room was utterly still, save for the faint hum of the recording equipment and the distant tick of the clock mounted high on the wall. Cruz's eyes darted briefly to the drives, then back to Jasmine, as though he could burn a hole through her with the force of his glare. But his face was losing color now, and the flush of anger from seconds ago was giving way to something far less controllable. His mouth opened, but the words stumbled out, clumsy and uneven. We need to stop this hearing," he said, the bluster gone, replaced by a thin thread of urgency that sounded far closer to pleading than commanding. The chairman didn't even glance at him. "Request denied," he said, the two words delivered with the cold finality of a gavel strike. That was it, no debate, no discussion, no lifeline. The sentence hung in the air for a beat before the room shifted again, the attention swinging toward the drives like a compass needle snapping north. Around the horseshoe of the committee table, several members began speaking almost at once, their voices overlapping in a quick, clipped chorus. "We need immediate verification of these files. Get them to the tech team now. Check the metadata." The commands were urgent, precise, no nonsense. Staffers moved quickly, the sound of papers being shuffled and keyboards tapped, underscoring the charged quiet that had settled over everything else. Cruz sank back into his chair with a force that made it groan under his weight. His shoulders hunched forward. The wide confrontational stance from moments ago collapsed into something smaller, more contained. The polished composure he'd carried into the room at the start of the hearing was nowhere to be seen now. He shifted once, twice, adjusting his tie, pressing his palm to his forehead for a brief second before dropping it back to the desk. Every movement read like a man trying to hold onto a mask that was already cracking, the pressure of the room pressing inward with every passing second. And in that moment, without a single further word from Jasmine, the balance of power in the chamber had visibly changed. The static weight of the previous moment still gripped the chamber when Jasmine moved again, her chair legs scraping lightly against the polished floor as she straightened. Every movement was deliberate, as if she wanted the entire room to feel the anticipation building in each second. She reached for her case, not in haste, but with the slow certainty of someone who knew the next move would land like a hammer. Her hand slipped inside, fingers closing around a single rigid document sleeve. When she drew it out, the transparent plastic caught the overhead lights, sending a faint glare across the room that briefly masked the text inside. Then she angled it, letting the contents come into full view. Bold letters at the top read "Sworn Statement," and below them, in firm black ink, was the name Michael Trent. Beneath the name was a thick, confident signature, drawn with the kind of finality that only comes when someone has decided there's no turning back. Jasmine held it high so everyone could see senators, aides, staffers, even the stenographer who stopped mid-keystroke to look. She cleared her throat and began to read, her voice cutting clean through the thick air. "I, Michael Trent, under oath, declare the following to be true and accurate to the best of my knowledge. On the date in question, at approximately 4 a.m., I was physically present during a phone call between Senator Ted Cruz and defense lobbyist Robert Ellison. I witnessed and participated in a discussion regarding the defense budget, during which Senator Cruz authorized a cash payment to me in exchange for lobbying efforts to secure its passage. I personally received said cash payment from Senator Cruz immediately following the conclusion of the call." She lowered the page, letting the silence in the room carry the weight of every word. The effect was instantaneous. A murmur rippled through the chamber, not the low hum of idle chatter, but the sharp, contained sound of shock trying to stay quiet. It was the kind of sound people make when they've just heard something that can't be easily undone. Jasmine didn't move, letting the silence work for her, letting the words settle into the bones of the room. The paper in her hand was steady, her grip unshaken, even as all eyes swung to Cruz like a compass needle snapping to magnetic north. Cruz didn't speak. His jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might try to summon a retort, but nothing came. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The flush of red that had been climbing his neck earlier was gone now, replaced by a pallor that made the sheen of sweat on his forehead stand out starkly under the cold light. He shifted in his seat, shoulders angling slightly away from the eyes locked on him. But the move was pointless. There was nowhere to hide in this room. The chair's voice cut through the charge, quiet, crisp, and decisive. A special investigation will commence immediately following this hearing. The words struck with the clarity of a verdict. There was no room for debate, no buffer of procedure, just a direct, public announcement that stripped away any illusion of safety Cruz might have been holding on to. A few senators leaned forward in their seats, exchanging glances that carried more weight than words could. Staffers scribbled notes faster, some tapping into tablets with quick, deliberate keystrokes. And then came the shift, palpable, undeniable. The energy in the chamber tilted, the center of gravity moving in an instant. Only minutes ago, a thread of suspicion had hovered over Jasmine, the weight of Cruz's accusations still fresh. But now that thread had been cut clean, replaced with something far heavier aimed directly at him. Eyes that had been measuring her were now boring into him, some sharp with accusation, others simply watching like spectators who know the next act will be the most brutal. Jasmine leaned forward, both hands resting lightly on the table, her posture relaxed yet grounded with intent. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The quiet around her gave every syllable room to carry. "Senator, the truth doesn't need permission to speak." The line wasn't delivered for drama, it was delivered like fact, and that made it all the more devastating. It was the kind of statement that didn't demand a reply, because any reply would sound smaller by comparison. For a moment, the room seemed to pause, not in confusion, but in recognition of what had just happened. It was a moment that marked the end of one balance of power and the beginning of another. In that pause, the air felt thicker, the hum of the overhead lights louder, the faint scratch of a pen suddenly sharp enough to hear from across the room. The tension didn't break. It crystallized, locking the scene into place as if the chamber itself understood the weight of what it had just witnessed. The first half of the hearing didn't close with a bang, but with the heavy, deliberate silence of a crowd still processing the turn it had just seen. Not a single voice rose to interrupt. No chair shifted. Even the usual background noises of movement and preparation were absent. Every person in that room, whether they stood with her, against her, or somewhere in between, knew that the ground had shifted under Cruz's feet, and there was no steadying it now. Jasmine didn't sit back right away. She let the moment breathe, her gaze sweeping the room once before settling, once again, on Cruz. His eyes didn't meet hers. The man who had, only an hour earlier, tried to pin her into a corner with rapid-fire accusations was now staring down at the desk in front of him, the papers there suddenly fascinating enough to hold all his attention. But the truth was written elsewhere in the set of his shoulders, in the shallow tightness of his breathing, in the sheen of sweat that had deepened on his brow. Around them, the chamber was still locked in that stunned, electric quiet. It wasn't the end of the fight, not by a long shot, but it was the end of the first 6 rounds. And Jasmine had walked out of them, not only standing, but holding the narrative in her hands. What she'd placed on the table in those minutes wasn't just evidence, it was a turning point, and everyone in the room knew it. The chamber was still steeped in the tension Jasmine had left behind when the chair leaned forward, his eyes scanning the semicircle of lawmakers as though weighing each one before speaking. His voice was measured, but the steel in it was unmistakable. This committee will now move to secure official testimony from Robert Ellison and Michael Trent. The sentence fell heavy, its authority undeniable. Around the room, aides shifted into motion immediately, their chairs scraping against the floor as they stood, phones already in hand. The sound of hushed but urgent voices began to fill the air, short bursts of instruction, confirmation, and scheduling. There was no delay, no procedural pause. Subpoenas were being drafted before Cruz could even adjust in his seat. It wasn't long before the next wave hit. Evidence began arriving from multiple channels, bank statements, with clean, machine-printed dates, wire transfer confirmations stamped with transaction IDs, and perhaps most damning of all, photocopies of handwritten ledgers. The paper trail was undeniable. Every figure, every timestamp lined up with the events caught in the recordings down to the exact minute. Some transfers were small enough to look like routine political donations. Others were large, split into multiple deposits over days, as if someone had tried to smuggle the truth past the numbers. It was forensic precision, The kind of alignment that told investigators they weren't dealing with coincidence, they were looking at a system. Cruz sat back, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, the tendons at his knuckles standing out under the strain. He had always been quick to respond in hearings, but now he seemed to choose silence, watching as pages of evidence passed from hand to hand. When he finally reached for his microphone, it was with the air of a man prepared to give ground, but only on his terms. "I am exercising my right to legislative immunity," he said, the words slow, almost careful, as though he wanted them to sound definitive. But the sound of it didn't carry the weight he intended. The phrase legislative immunity was meant to be a shield, but in this room, at this moment, it rang hollow, more like a wall hastily built in a storm. Senators who had once sat leaning comfortably toward him now sat back, their chairs angled subtly away. A few exchanged brief, quiet words, their eyes moving between Cruz and the evidence piling up on the desk before them. It was in those glances, quick, darting, yet unmistakable, that the shift became obvious. This wasn't just an attack from across the aisle. The isolation was coming from within his own ranks. The aide's movements grew sharper, more deliberate. A young staffer moved from the evidence table to the chair's side, whispering something that made the older man's jaw tighten. Across the room, another aide tapped the screen of a tablet, nodding quickly before stepping toward a pair of committee members to share whatever had just been confirmed. Every small action built the sense that the noose of process, the grinding, methodical machinery of an investigation, was tightening around Cruz. He tried to keep his posture upright, but the strain was visible now. His shoulders sagged slightly when he thought no one was watching, and the once confident set of his jaw had softened into something less certain. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, holding it for a moment longer than necessary before taking a measured sip. It was a small gesture, but in the stillness of the room it drew eyes. Then came the murmurs, quiet at first, then spreading. They weren't the scattered noises of a distracted audience. They were focused, purposeful, the kind of low hum that builds when people start aligning on the same conclusion. A few committee members leaned toward their microphones, making notes for the record about the need for expedited verification of the evidence. Check the metadata on all transactions. Nampa cross-reference with the recording timestamps. Get sworn depositions from Ellison and Trent on the calendar immediately. Their voices were calm but clipped, each request sounding less like a suggestion and more like an instruction already halfway to being carried out. Cruz's gaze moved from face to face, searching for the anchor points that had always been there. Colleagues who would meet his eye, nod slightly, signal that he still had their backing. But now those small assurances were gone. The few who did look his way gave nothing back, no nod, no flicker of solidarity, just neutral, unreadable expressions. The chair didn't need to gavel the room into order. The momentum had shifted on its own, carried by the weight of the evidence and the urgency with which the committee was moving. It was clear to everyone present that the hearing was no longer a debate. It was a staging ground for something bigger, something that would move beyond this room and into the machinery of formal investigation. The shield Cruz had tried to raise was paper thin, and the pressure against it was coming from every direction. And as the aides moved swiftly to lock in the next steps, subpoenas in motion, documents cataloged, testimony dates in play, the air in the chamber seemed to grow heavier, charged with the knowledge that the quiet part of this battle was over. What came next would be louder, sharper, and impossible for Cruz to sidestep. The walls were closing in, and even he could see there was nowhere left to run. The weight of the hearing didn't stop at the chamber doors. It spilled into the marble hallways of the Capitol, into the side rooms where alliances were brokered, and into the hushed corners where careers were quietly assessed. Senators who had once walked into committee meetings with Cruz, laughing in low tones and clasping him on the shoulder, now found other routes to their seats. Some avoided his gaze altogether. Others offered polite nods without slowing their pace. One of his oldest allies, a man who had defended him fiercely on the floor more than once, muttered under his breath as he passed, "We can't carry this," before disappearing into a side elevator, leaving Cruz alone in the corridor staring at the closing doors. It wasn't just social distancing, it was structural. In the cloakrooms, where party business is spoken more plainly than on the record, His name was now part of the whispered problem list. Conversations that once included him were happening without him. Staffers who used to brief him directly now sent their memos through intermediaries, as if proximity to him might carry a cost. The tone was cautious, but not sympathetic. Leadership began to take formal steps, disguised as routine housekeeping. In a cramped, windowless conference room in the basement of the Capitol, senior members sat around a polished oak table, folders open, their expressions unreadable. The words were measured, but the meaning was clear. Committee assignments are privileges, not rights, one chair said evenly, his hand resting on a thin stack of papers. From the top of that stack, a memo slid across the table, a proposal to strip Cruz of 2 key committee positions. No one raised their voice, but the silence that followed the proposal was an answer in itself. Outside those meetings, the machinery of political isolation began turning with quiet efficiency. Schedules were adjusted, shifting hearings and appearances to panels where Cruz would have no seat. Subcommittee leadership roles he'd once held were reassigned without ceremony, replaced with names less likely to attract controversy. These weren't dramatic purges, they were precise cuts, each one small enough to be denied if asked about, but large enough to weaken his reach. Donors noticed. Calls that had once been answered on the first ring went to voicemail. Messages sent through aides received curt replies or none at all. A fundraiser for a key defense contract lobbyist, a man Cruz had met with more times than the record comfortably allowed, was suddenly postponed indefinitely. It wasn't just that the money was drying up, it was that the money was moving elsewhere. And then there were the closed-door meetings. They happened in back offices and Senate leadership suites, sometimes in the corner of the caucus lunch where reporters weren't allowed. The discussions were clinical, stripped of any pretense of loyalty. "He's a liability," one senior senator said flatly. "The optics alone could bleed us through midterms." Another younger member leaned back in his chair and added, "If he's off the committees, he's off the radar. Out of sight, out of mind." The others didn't disagree. The news of these meetings didn't leak in full. There were no headlines, no press statements, but hints began to circulate. A well-timed question from a reporter, a knowing glance between 2 aides in the hallway, a brief no comment from a leadership spokesperson. It was enough for everyone paying attention to understand. The ground was moving under Cruz's feet, and it wasn't shifting in his favor. Inside the caucus, the mood changed. Members who might have defended him a week earlier now measured their words in public and chose their seats carefully in private. Those who remained in his orbit did so at arm's length, speaking to him in low tones and breaking off quickly when others approached. The inner circle that had once been robust, a dozen or more ready to back him in any fight, was now thin, reduced to a handful of loyalists whose own influence was limited. By the end of the week, the visual told the story better than any memo could. Cruz walked into the anteroom before a leadership briefing, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, for the subtle nods and gestures that meant he still had weight in the room. What he found instead were turned shoulders, clipped greetings, and the cold space of political survival. The conversations kept moving without him, and the ring of allies that had once been loud, present, and unshakable had shrunk into a tight, brittle circle, a barrier that was as much about keeping him in as it was about keeping the rest of the Senate out. The political isolation had already sunk its claws in deep, but when the committee reconvened for the next session, the weight of it became something physical, a pressure you could almost feel in the air. The room was fuller than before, but quieter, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness the point where speculation gave way to something far more dangerous. Proof. Cruz took his seat slowly, his eyes fixed forward, not acknowledging the subtle stares or the hushed conversations that cut off the moment he entered. He kept his hands folded tightly on the desk, the knuckles pale, the posture rigid. It was the stance of a man bracing for impact. The chair wasted no time. "We will now enter into the record the sworn statements of Michael Trent and Robert Ellison, both signed under penalty of perjury," he announced, his tone clipped and neutral, but carrying the kind of gravity that made the entire chamber lean forward. On the long table in front of him, 2 folders sat open, each containing pages stamped, notarized, and marked with the formal seal of the court. An aide stepped forward, placing copies before each member of the committee. The shuffle of paper echoed sharply in the silence. Each statement began the same way: full legal name, date, and the declaration of truth. But it was the body of the text that drew the oxygen from the room. Trent's account was meticulous. The exact time of the 4 a.m. call, the location where he stood during it, and the details of the conversation he overheard between Cruz and Ellison. He described the moment Cruz authorized a cash payment for lobbying the defense budget's passage, and how he himself received that payment in cash minutes later. His words weren't dramatic, they were clinical, and that made them harder to escape. Ellison's statement matched it point for point. He admitted his role as an intermediary, confirming the sequence of calls, the transfer of money, and the political quid pro quo that followed. The language was dry, legalistic, but every sentence tied another knot in the rope tightening around Cruz. The chair gave the room a moment to absorb it, then leaned into his microphone. Let the record show both statements are consistent with the audio evidence previously entered. That line alone was enough to send a fresh ripple through the senators present. Cruz sat still, but his stillness looked less like discipline now and more like containment, a deliberate effort to keep from showing the weight of what was unfolding. He didn't look at the papers in front of him. He didn't look at Trent or Ellison, both of whom were seated in the witness area, their faces impassive. Instead, he kept his gaze low, fixed somewhere between the tabletop and the edge of the microphone, as if the smaller his world became, the less this moment could touch him. And then, across from him, Jasmine leaned forward. Her posture was relaxed, but her presence filled the space. She didn't rush her words, didn't attempt to sharpen them into an attack. Her tone was steady, unshaken, and all the more powerful for it. "This is not a personal victory," she said, her voice carrying cleanly to every corner of the chamber. "This is a victory for transparency." It wasn't said for effect. It wasn't a flourish for the cameras. It was a statement of principle, delivered in the same manner she might read an oath or a statute. And in that delivery, it became more than a line, it became the pivot point of the day. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was the silence of recognition, of every person in the room understanding the truth of what they just heard and what it meant. That silence didn't last long. A senator to Jasmine's left adjusted his microphone and spoke first. His voice was level but unyielding. "It's time for you to resign." The words cut through the air without any trace of theater, just a plain, blunt demand. Another senator leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Cruz. "The integrity of this body demands it," he said, his tone sharper, the syllables clipped. His statement was more than a suggestion, it was a challenge, one that carried the weight of expectation from the chamber. One by one, other members of the committee followed. Some were calm, speaking as though they were reciting an unavoidable fact. Others let their frustration show, voices rising slightly as they spoke of damage to public trust, of the weight this scandal would place on their institution. "This is not about party lines," one senator stated, leaning back in her chair with her hands folded. "This is about whether we have the courage to hold ourselves to the standards we claim to represent." Cruz's expression didn't change, but his shoulders seemed to draw inward by fractions as each call for his resignation landed. He sat as if trying to absorb the blows without flinching, but the tightening around his mouth betrayed the strain. What made the scene electric wasn't just the words, it was who they were coming from. These weren't just political opponents. Some of the voices belonged to people who had once been allies, co-signers on legislation, co-panelists on policy announcements. Their withdrawal now wasn't just personal, it was structural, signaling a collapse of the support network he'd once relied on. The chair let the statements pile up, not rushing to close the floor. It was as if he understood the importance of letting the air saturate with this moment, of letting Cruz feel each voice add to the chorus. Every senator who spoke wasn't just addressing him, they were adding weight to the record, ensuring that history would read this day for what it was. When the final call for resignation was spoken, the chair leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. No gavel strike, no formal adjournment, just the quiet that followed when everything that needed to be said had been said. In that stillness, the room felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves had moved in a little closer. Cruz remained seated, his eyes on the desk, the folders, the microphone anywhere but on the people who had just stripped away the last shreds of political cover he had. The evidence sat inches from him, the signatures in black ink like fixed points in a map that led only in one direction. And across from him, Jasmine sat the same way she had at the start, calm, steady, and unshaken, her presence in the room, no longer that of a challenger, but of someone who had shifted the entire center of gravity. The weight of the hearing lingered in the air long after the last call for his resignation. Cruz sat motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the grain of the desk in front of him, as if avoiding every other pair of eyes in the room might somehow make them disappear. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the silence with a steady, low vibration. Finally, without a word, he pushed back his chair. The sound of the legs scraping across the floor echoed sharply against the chamber walls. He rose slowly, gathering the few papers in front of him with a mechanical precision that looked less like order and more like avoidance. There was no glance toward his colleagues, no acknowledgement of the committee members still watching him. He turned, walking toward the exit with the deliberate steps of a man determined not to hurry, but unable to slow down. The double doors loomed ahead, and beyond them, the inevitable chaos of the waiting press corps. He didn't break stride as the doors swung open. The bright glare of camera lights hit him instantly, accompanied by a surge of voices shouting over each other. "Senator, do you plan to resign? Will you contest the findings? Do you have a response to the sworn statements?" Each question came like a volley, but he didn't so much as tilt his head. His jaw was set, the lines around his mouth drawn tight. The only sound from him was the steady rhythm of his shoes on the marble floor, sharp, echoing, unbroken. At the far end of the corridor, an elevator waited. He pressed the button, the glow of it reflecting faintly in his eyes. The door slid open with a soft chime, and without looking back, he stepped inside. The doors closed, sealing him away, and the reflection in the polished metal vanished with him. Back in the hearing room, the air felt different, lighter for some, heavier for others. The noise from the hallway faded, leaving only the faint shuffling of papers and the occasional creak of a chair as the remaining members adjusted in their seats. Jasmine Crockett was still at her place, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. When she stood, it wasn't with the energy of someone claiming victory, but with the calm certainty of someone closing the final page of a chapter she knew would matter. She stepped to the microphone, her movements deliberate, the echo of her heels carrying across the now quiet chamber. Her eyes swept the room, once meeting the gaze of each remaining senator before she spoke. Her voice was measured, firm, but it carried a weight that cut through the silence like a clean blade. "If we let power outrun the truth," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to sink in, "we will lose both." The sentence landed without resistance. No one tried to speak over her. No one shifted uncomfortably in their seat. It was the kind of statement that didn't leave space for rebuttal. It didn't challenge. It concluded. The moment it was spoken, it felt as if it had been waiting in the air all along, and she had simply given it form. Around her, the committee members began to gather their papers. Chairs were pushed back with muted sounds. Folders snapped shut. The soft rustle of fabric as coats were pulled on blended into the low murmur of quiet goodbyes. There was no applause, no outburst, just the slow, inevitable winding down of a session that had taken the air out of everyone present. One by one, they filed out through the side doors, the sound of their footsteps receding down the hallway. Staffers followed, their arms loaded with binders and evidence folders, their faces still carrying the residue of the day's intensity. A few glanced back over their shoulders at the chamber before leaving, as though they were marking the memory of what had unfolded here. The room grew emptier, quieter. The light still hummed overhead, casting the same cold, even glow across the curved dais in the long witness table. Jasmine remained for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She wasn't looking at the microphones, the stacks of documents, or the now vacant chairs. She was looking past them, as if seeing the events of the day already settling into history. Finally, she stepped back, leaving her place behind. The last of the staffers closed the side door with a muted click, and the sound echoed faintly in the now empty space. The chamber was still, but it didn't feel dead. It felt suspended, as if holding the echo of everything that had been said within its walls. And then there was that other echo, Faint at first, almost imagined, but unmistakable. The ghostly playback of the 4 a.m. recording. The cadence of Cruz's voice, caught and frozen in digital clarity, seemed to hang in the air like a shadow. Make sure the defense budget passes. If it takes cash to win, so be it. Those words, once whispered in confidence, had been dragged into the light here. Now, in the emptiness, they seemed to linger as a reminder that truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish, it reverberates. The chamber, stripped of people but not of presence, seemed to breathe with that sound. The tables, the microphones, even the high-backed chairs stood like silent witnesses, holding the memory of the confrontation. And above it all, the soft hum of the lights and the faint imagined hiss of the recording merged into one steady note, proof that silence doesn't always mean the absence of a voice. Sometimes it means the truth is still speaking, long after everyone has gone. The echo in that chamber did not fade quickly. It lingered in the air like the aftershock of an explosion, settling deep into the walls, the seats, the wooden grain of the long table. This was not just the end of a hearing, it was the slow exhale after a storm that had changed the ground beneath it. The lesson that emerged here was raw and unvarnished. The fight between power and truth is never a clean one, and it never ends in silence. It ends with scars, with reputations altered, with a shift in the unspoken rules of how power is wielded and how it can be challenged. This was not merely the story of Cruz's silence or Jasmine's poise. It was a blueprint for anyone who has ever been told to sit down when they knew they had to stand. The danger of letting power slip free from truth is not that it wins in one hearing or one bill. It's that it sets a precedent, an invisible permission slip for corruption to run unchecked. Jasmine understood this deeply. That is why she spoke not as someone savoring a personal triumph, but as a witness to something larger, a reminder that truth's survival depends on people willing to take blows for it. Her words, "If we let power outrun the truth, we will lose both," were not crafted for applause. They were spoken like a verdict, a final ruling that would outlast the day. Power without truth is a loaded gun with no safety. Truth without courage is an unopened letter, a message that never reaches the hands that need it most. In that chamber, those two forces, truth and power, collided in front of everyone, and the result was not an easy moral fable. It was messy, it was dangerous, and it was real. The price Jasmine paid to stand there facing the glares, the interruptions, the veiled threats was not visible to those outside the room, but it was heavy. She didn't win because the evidence was overwhelming. She won because she refused to be worn down before the truth could stand on its own feet. The power of her stand was not just in the documents she carried or the witnesses who testified, it was in the refusal to surrender the narrative to those who had the louder microphone. Too often, history is written by the ones with the podium, while the truth is left sitting in the back row, waiting for someone to notice it. Jasmine's fight showed that the podium can be taken, that the microphone can be redirected, and that the narrative can be forced to change direction when enough courage is behind it. This was not the kind of fight you win in a single strike. It was the kind you win by holding your ground long enough for the ground itself to shift. And yet, the most important lesson was not about winning at all. It was about what is lost when truth is silenced. Letting lies take root is like letting cracks form in a foundation, small at first, but soon capable of bringing down the entire structure. Cruz's silence in the end was not the sound of someone defeated by an opponent. It was the sound of someone who had no defense left against the truth. That silence was its own confession. It said more than any closing statement ever could. For those watching, whether in the gallery or across the country, the takeaway was clear. The truth will not fight for itself. It needs people to fight for it. But those who step forward should know the risks. They will be outnumbered. They will be targeted. They will be told it's not worth it. And still, they must choose to speak. Because when power runs ahead of truth, it doesn't just trample over facts. It tramples over people, over communities, over the very idea that justice means anything at all. The truth in this case had a voice because Jasmine gave it one. She was not perfect, she was not untouchable, but she was unyielding. And that unyielding nature is what turned a set of cold, impersonal documents into something alive, something undeniable. This hearing will not be remembered for the formal language in the transcripts. It will be remembered for the moment one woman stood in front of a wall of power and said, without raising her voice, "The truth doesn't need permission to speak." In the months and years to come, that line will not just belong to Jasmine Crockett, it will belong to anyone who finds themselves in the same position, staring down the same weight of authority, knowing that the easy path is to back away. But easy paths don't change the direction of history. Hard ones do. The truth will always be heavier to carry than a lie because it comes with responsibility. But if no one carries it, then it's not just the truth that's lost, it's the very idea that we are capable of justice at all. That is why the empty chamber, with its lingering echo of the 4 a.m. recording, was not just a scene from the end of a political drama, it was a warning. The warning that every time we allow power to go unchallenged, we give up a piece of the ground beneath us. The echo was not just the sound of a voice in a recording, it was the sound of every truth that has ever waited too long to be heard. And it will keep echoing in different rooms, in different fights, until enough people decide that silence is no longer an option. The silence that lingered after Cruz's exit was not the quiet of relief, it was the kind of stillness that hums with unfinished business. Every person in that chamber knew what they had just witnessed was bigger than one scandal, one senator, or one hearing. It was a reminder carved into the air itself. Power is not a permanent possession, it is a lease, and the rent is paid in truth. Jasmine's final words, "If we let power outrun the truth, we will lose both," were not a parting shot. They were a challenge, a mirror held up to everyone in the room, and to everyone who would hear this story in the days to come. She hadn't fought to humiliate one man. She had fought to remind the entire system that legitimacy has to be earned, day after day, decision after decision. That kind of fight doesn't end with the sound of a gavel. It spills out of the walls onto the streets, into homes, and onto the desks of citizens who now have a choice to make. That choice is not abstract, it is direct, tangible, and immediate. Every time someone ignores a policy they don't understand, or a budget line they don't question, the imbalance grows. Every time someone stays silent when they know a truth that could protect others, the walls of accountability crack a little more. Jasmine's stand in that hearing wasn't about heroics, it was about showing what's possible when someone refuses to accept the script handed to them. She had been told to back down, to play nice, to wait her turn. Instead, she walked in with evidence, laid it out for all to see, and dared the Senate to pretend it wasn't real. That act didn't just corner Cruz, it reminded the public that these halls are meant to belong to them, but the truth only keeps its place if the public demands it, protects it, and refuses to let it be traded away in backroom deals. So what now? Now the responsibility shifts from the lone voice at the table to the collective chorus outside it. Power bends when it knows people are watching, and it breaks when that watchfulness turns into relentless pressure. That means showing up not just when scandals explode, but when the cameras are gone, when the meetings are small, and when the votes are buried in technical language meant to make you look away. Call your representatives, ask them to put their answers in writing, and follow up until you get them. Demand public access to financial disclosures and committee records, and support legislation that strengthens oversight rather than weakens it. When they stall, push harder. When they hide behind jargon, strip it away. And when they try to distract you with outrage over trivialities, remember that the real work is in the details they hope you never read. The truth is not self-sustaining, it survives only when carried forward. Think about the witnesses who stepped forward in Jasmine's case, Michael Trent and Robert Ellison. Neither of them was a household name before this. They didn't have armies of supporters or safety nets of influence. What they had was the conviction that looking the other way would make them complicit, and they stepped up, knowing there could be backlash. That's the cost of protecting transparency. It's uncomfortable, it's risky, and it doesn't come with applause in the moment, but it's also the reason that hearing ended the way it did. Imagine what could happen if that level of courage wasn't rare, if it was the norm. If people treated exposing wrongdoing as a civic duty, not a dangerous exception. That is how cultures change, and that is how systems clean themselves from the inside out. There's also the lesson that integrity doesn't just live in grand moments, it lives in the small choices that lead up to them. The fact that Jasmine had those recordings, the sworn statements, and the bank documents wasn't luck. It was preparation. It was months of refusing to let dead ends stop her, of following paper trails no one else wanted to bother with, of protecting sources others would have abandoned. That kind of persistence is not glamorous, but it's what makes the difference between rumors and proof. And it's a reminder to everyone watching that if you want to hold the powerful accountable, you have to do the work before the spotlight finds you. You have to be ready to prove the truth when the moment comes, because hesitation is exactly what entrenched power counts on. The stakes of this moment reach far beyond Cruz's political career. They touch on the central question of any democracy. Who gets to decide what the truth is? If the answer is those with the most influence, then the game is already lost. If the answer is the people armed with facts, then there's still hope. But that hope requires vigilance that doesn't fade after the headline cycle ends. It requires ordinary citizens to act like shareholders in the nation they own, scrutinizing leadership, demanding results, and firing those who break trust. Jasmine's fight was not about securing her own position. It was about reminding everyone that these seats of power are temporary assignments from the public, not birthrights. And if the public forgets that, they will wake up one day to find that the truth no longer has a place in the room. This is why the call to action now matters more than ever. The temptation will be to treat this as a victory and move on. But that is exactly what corrupt systems rely on: short attention spans and fleeting outrage. Don't give them that. Keep asking questions. Keep pressing for follow-up on the investigations. Keep track of which senators demanded answers and which ones looked away. Reward those who defended transparency and replace those who didn't. And most importantly, keep the conversation alive in your own circles. Corruption thrives in silence. Accountability grows in dialogue. Make sure your community knows this story, not as gossip, but as proof of what persistence can achieve. Jasmine's words should not be remembered as a poetic flourish. They should be a rallying cry. If we let power outrun the truth, we will lose both. That is not a warning for politicians alone. It's for every person who thinks their voice doesn't matter. Because the truth is, no single voice wins this fight. It's the accumulation of thousands of small acts, phone calls, public records requests, meeting attendance, whistleblower support that tilts the balance. And every time one person chooses to act, they make it harder for power to hide. That's the legacy this hearing should leave behind, not the fall of one senator, but the rise of a public that refuses to let the truth be an orphan. If there's one takeaway from that empty hearing room and the faint echo of the 4 a.m. recording, it's this. The truth will always find a way to speak, but it needs people to carry it. The walls don't remember. The microphones don't care. The files can be buried. But the public can choose to remember, to care, and to dig them back up when it matters. And it will matter again because power doesn't sleep, and neither can the people who intend to keep it honest. This is the moment to decide whether we will be spectators to the next abuse or participants in stopping it before it starts. The choice is here, now, and it belongs to every one of us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.